Hello everyone, welcome back. People like to imagine history as silk fans, candlelight, and everyone moving in slow motion. In reality, most of it was itchy clothes, confusing rules, and makeup that could probably kill you faster than a duel. The Geisha world had all of this, plus lead poisoning. Truly the complete package. Before we dive in, hit like and subscribe to join our global community. Wherever you're watching from, drop your city and your local time in the comments. It's how we turn history into a conversation that belongs to all of us. Headphones on, symmetry achieved, underwear secured. Congratulations, you're officially ready for history, our way. Our journey begins with a simple question. Why paint your face white if it quietly ruins your lungs? Some things never change. Fashion has always been allergic to common sense. The classic geisha look wasn't moisturizer and sunscreen. It was cover your entire face with powder made of lead. Yes, the same thing we now ban from water pipes and kids' toys. Back then, it was beauty in a box. You'd grind it, mix it with water, smear it on, and then wonder why you suddenly felt dizzy during a tea ceremony. No one thought it was strange. If your cousin coughed blood, the explanation wasn't, maybe the powder is toxic. It was, spirits are upset again. Better wave some incense. That was their version of restarting the Wi-Fi router. Didn't solve the problem, but hey, at least you tried. The reason for this ghost white mask was simple. Candlelight. A room filled with flickering flames would swallow natural skin tones. But white makeup glowed. It made you visible, like a neon sign on a dark road. Except instead of Exit 42 Motel, it was, please admire my shamisen solo. But glowing came with a cost. Imagine sitting still while someone layers paste across your cheeks until your pores feel like they've been cemented shut. Breathing through that was like trying to nap under 3 damp towels. Glamorous? Sure. Comfortable? Not even close. And the paste cracked, so your smile could split like old bathroom tiles mid-conversation. Guests pretended not to notice, but you know someone went home and whispered, her forehead looked like pottery. The powder had a smell too. Not floral, not herbal, more like licking a coin by accident. Now mix that with incense smoke, sweat, and grilled snacks from the street outside. That was your nightly cologne. Honestly, Axe body spray might have been an improvement. Some geisha even slept in the stuff, because taking it off meant scrubbing for hours with rice bran. So you went to bed in full white face, woke up looking like a porcelain doll left out in the rain, and left ghostly stains on the pillow. Housekeeping nightmare. Why endure this? Same reason people buy shoes that hurt after 10 minutes. Beauty equals status. Pale face meant leisure. It said, I don't work in the fields. I don't stir soup in the kitchen. I am above sweat. Even if privately your lungs disagreed. It was armor. It was also a trap. No mask, no roll. With mask you got headaches, nausea, and sometimes worse. It was basically the historical equivalent of downloading a free app. You'd get the features, sure, but also 17 viruses. Picture an apprentice, 14 years old, practicing in front of a cloudy bronze mirror. She sneezes mid-application. Powder everywhere. The cat, the floor, the little brother, everybody glowing pale like backup dancers in a ghost parade. That scene definitely happened, even if nobody wrote it down. And then there were the eyebrows. Tradition meant shaving them off and drawing new ones higher up. Like Photoshop, but permanent. You looked calm, refined, serene, until the awkward stubble grew back. Guests never saw the itchy regrowth phase. Lucky them. Lips, tiny, painted red. Not full, not glossy, just 2 little dots. The idea was restraint. The result? You looked like you'd stolen jam, which frankly, probably added charm. Learning all this wasn't glamorous either. Apprentices sat still for hours while senior women corrected every brushstroke. A crooked line wasn't just sloppy, it was shameful. Some girls cried streaking the powder, which meant starting over. It was less beauty routine, more final boss level in a video game, where the controller disconnects. And yet, When it worked, the effect was hypnotic. In a candlelit room, skin glowed, lips shimmered, and the illusion was complete. Guests saw elegance. The women inside the mask mostly felt like they'd been microwaved. Would you survive one night? Step 1. Paste your face until it's unrecognizable. Step 2. Pretend you're not itchy, dizzy, or tasting pennies. Step 3. Smile without cracking. Fail any of those, and congratulations. You're not booked for tomorrow. That was just the makeup. And it was only the start. Let's talk logistics, because putting on the white mask wasn't some quick 5-minute routine. It was an industrial process. You weren't getting ready. You were volunteering as a construction site. First step, prepping the skin. Oils, scrubbing, sometimes even scraping. Tools that looked suspiciously like they'd been borrowed from the kitchen. A rice paddle to apply ointment? Normal. A bamboo spatula near your nose? Also normal. Somewhere out there, a teenage apprentice had to sit perfectly still, while an older woman approached with what looked like salad tongs. Then came the powder itself. Cakes of lead-based makeup, ground with water into paste. The texture? Somewhere between pancake batter and wood glue, except you weren't allowed to lick the spoon, unless you sneezed at the wrong time. Then surprise, congratulations, you've inhaled your skincare. Layer after layer was brushed across your face. Too thin, and you looked blotchy, like you lost a fight with chalk. Too thick, and you cracked halfway through a performance. Guests didn't pay for drywall impressions. They wanted porcelain, and this wasn't a solo ritual. You weren't in your bathroom mirror humming to yourself. You were in a crowded okiya, shoulder to shoulder with other apprentices, all slowly vanishing under the same white paste. From the corner, it looked less like beauty prep and more like Ghost Army recruitment day. The sound? Dozens of brushes scratching in rhythm. Someone's stomach growling because dinner got delayed. Maybe a senior scolding in the background. The smell? A mix of damp chalk, burnt oil and incense. Add summer humidity, and you've basically invented the world's first chemical weapon. And you had to sit still for hours. Wiggle, and the senior smacked your shoulder with the back of the brush. They called it discipline. You called it a souvenir bruise shaped like a calligraphy stroke. Sometimes accidents happened. A brush slipped, powder splattered. A sneeze clouded the room. Cats walked across trays. Somewhere in Kyoto, a maiko went on stage with a paw print on her cheek, pretending it was part of the design. The hairline was especially tricky. The paste had to blend neatly into the scalp without going too far. Done right, it framed the face elegantly. Done wrong, it looked like you were wearing a half-melted helmet. Either way, you couldn't scratch. Imagine the itch. Imagine not scratching. That's discipline. Now, the famous neck, painstakingly left bare, a little triangle of skin peeking out at the nape. This was considered the height of allure. Why? Because it was rare to see. Neck triangles were basically the ankle picks of medieval Japan. People wrote poems about them. Imagine being immortalized for not wearing foundation on 2 square inches of skin. The irony writes itself. You paint your entire face into a toxic shell, but the one place you don't paint is the sexiest part. It's like buying a luxury car and discovering everyone only compliments the cup holders. And let's not forget the cost. High-quality powder wasn't cheap. Every tray mixed, every brushstroke applied. It all went on your tab at the okiya. More layers meant more debt. By the time your face was complete, your wallet was already unfinished. But there was no shortcut. Guests expected flawlessness. Imagine a wealthy patron arriving, and your forehead's flaking like stale pastry. Social death, they'd whisper. You'd never live down, crumbly face girl. So, hacks emerged. Some mixed powder with oils. Others added sake for smoother texture. One rumour said the fumes got you tipsy without drinking. Another claimed herbal blends stopped the headaches. Reality check. Nothing stopped the headaches. At best, you smelled faintly like salad dressing, while still coughing dust. And yet, once finished, the effect was undeniable. Under lantern light, you looked untouchable, more statue than human. Guests fell silent, not because they thought you divine, but because they knew the sheer effort required not to sneeze. Think about the weight of it. Hours of work, pores sealed shut, layers stiffening like plaster. Smiling felt like bending ceramic. Laugh too hard, and your face literally fractured. Still, you were expected to pour tea, sing, and maybe dance, all while trying not to choke on a powder cloud lodged in your throat. Imagine being 14, painted into this role. You've got a shamisen lesson after this. You've got etiquette drills. You've got to entertain people twice your age without blinking powder into their drinks. Could you handle that? Could you sit through hours of toxic paste, itchy scalp, locked muscles, and emerge elegant? Or would you tap out halfway through, rubbing your face raw and muttering, "Nope, this job is haunted"? And remember, we're still only at step 1, makeup. The night hasn't even started. At some point, someone had to invent the Geisha starter kit. Powder trays, brushes, pins, wax for hair. Basically, a medieval Sephora, except nothing was cruelty-free. Every stick of incense, every drop of oil, it all counted toward the bill. You weren't investing in beauty, you were being gently mugged by the Okia accountant. The math was simple. The more flawless you looked, the more debt you carried. It's like student loans, except instead of a diploma, you get a stiff neck and a fan you're not allowed to drop. The teeth, yes, let's talk about those. Blackened teeth were once considered peak chic. You'd paint them with a sticky dye made from iron filings mixed with vinegar. It left your mouth looking like a burnt rice cracker. Guests called it elegant. Secretly, half of them were terrified. Imagine sipping tea and flashing a smile so dark it could absorb candlelight. That's not charm. That's an eclipse. Even the eyebrows got a rebrand. First step, shave them clean. Second step, draw new ones slightly higher. Like your face just remembered a shocking secret. You didn't control your expression. Your makeup artist did. Somewhere in history, a maiko probably argued, "But these make me look surprised forever." And the senior replied, "Perfect." Guests love surprises now. All of this was happening in real time, in noisy, cramped prep rooms. Picture half a dozen apprentices lined up, all getting powdered, waxed and painted. The air thick with dust, the occasional cough echoing like a drum. Someone sneezed, powder cloud everywhere. For a second the room looked like a haunted house attraction, except everyone inside was too tired to scream. And don't forget the wigs. Traditional hairstyles weren't just complicated, they were architectural. Layers of wax stiffened the strands into shapes with poetic names like split peach or butterfly, lovely in theory, itchy in reality. You couldn't rest your head on a pillow without wrecking it, so you used a wooden headrest instead. Imagine trying to nap on a doorstop. Every morning your neck woke up before you did. The scalp underneath never saw mercy. Wax build up, stray pins digging in, the occasional insect deciding this was prime real estate. It was all part of the package. One unlucky apprentice probably scratched too hard, dislodged half her style, and had to explain why she suddenly looked like she lost a duel with a beehive. And then, the fan. Such a simple prop, but it had rules. Hold it too low, scandalous. Too high, ridiculous. Too fast, distracting. Too slow, boring. Basically, it was the historical equivalent of texting etiquette. One wrong move, and someone decided you were uncultured. Guests didn't want honesty. They wanted illusions. You weren't a teenager with a cramp in your wrist. You were elegance in motion, hopefully not sneezing. Of course, the health bill came due eventually. Lead poisoning doesn't announce itself politely. First the headaches, then fatigue, sometimes nausea, sometimes worse. Historical records mention women fainting mid-performance. Imagine playing shamisen, bowing politely, then crumpling like a puppet with its strings cut. Everyone politely blamed delicate constitution, which was code for "we poisoned her, but it looked great." The irony is brutal. Beauty killed slowly, and everyone knew. But walking away wasn't an option. The Okiya owned the makeup, the tools, the kimono, the very roof overhead. You couldn't exactly say, "I'll just go barefaced and freelance." There was no freelance. You were locked in the system, painted white, and smiling through it. Guests rarely noticed the toll. Under soft lantern light, all they saw was perfection. A face smooth as porcelain, lips like lacquer, teeth, if still blackened, shining faintly in the glow. They didn't hear the pounding headaches. They didn't feel the heat trapped under layers of kimono. They saw the mask, not the human, and that was the point. The mask wasn't decoration, it was a role. It said, "I am untouchable, I am refined, I am here for your admiration." Whether your lungs agreed or not, didn't matter. In the performance economy, beauty was armor. Armor that crumbled from the inside out. You wonder how anyone lasted more than a year. But they did, sometimes decades. The body adapts, or at least pretends to. Maybe the dizziness fades, or you just stop noticing. Maybe headaches become background noise, like the hum of a lantern or the gossip of other girls. Survival wasn't about comfort. It was about pretending long enough for patrons to believe the illusion. And here's the part nobody wrote in poetry: the after-hours clean-up. Removing the paste took as long as applying it. Oils rubbed in, cloths scraping, basins of water turning cloudy grey. By the end, the apprentice looked less like a delicate flower and more like someone who'd lost a fight with a sack of flour. Pillows stained, collars smeared, nails crusted with chalk. Tomorrow, the whole cycle started again. That's the catch. You weren't putting on makeup. You were building a costume that consumed your health. Step out of line, and the Okiya reminded you, elegance has a price. And you're paying, one cough at a time. So ask yourself, could you survive that? Could you sit through hours of toxic paste, waxed hair, blackened teeth, stiff collars, and emerge smiling? Or would you tap out muttering, "Nope, I'll just be a farmer, thanks"? Either way, you're still not through the night. Makeup was just the prologue. The irony is that the white mask was supposed to symbolize purity. Guests whispered about its glow. Poets wrote clumsy verses about moonlight on porcelain cheeks. And yet underneath the glow, your pores were screaming like prisoners of war. There's no sonnet for clogged skin, though maybe there should be. Let's not forget the kimono pressing against all of this. 11, sometimes 12 layers, silk heavy enough to bench press you. Combined with the makeup, it was like locking your body in a sauna, while your face pretended to be a temple statue. Sweat trickled under the collars, but you weren't allowed to dab it. Dab once, ruin the paint, restart the evening. It wasn't beauty under pressure. It was pressure pretending to be beauty. Every guest, of course, assumed the look came effortlessly. That's how illusions work. They didn't see the 3-hour prep, or the bruises from hairpins, or the faint rattling cough behind the polite laugh. They saw perfection, uncracked and glowing. And you delivered, because the moment you stopped delivering, you stopped being useful. The Okiya didn't train girls with headaches. They trained masks. That mask wasn't optional. It wasn't like modern makeup where you can skip foundation if you're feeling lazy. Without the mask, you weren't a maiko, you weren't a geisha. You were just a kid in a robe. The mask was the admission ticket, the uniform, the contract. Without it, you couldn't even enter the stage. And this wasn't just about men watching women in pretty clothes. The mask played into social hierarchies, class divides, cultural expectations. Guests came from samurai families, wealthy merchants, even the occasional foreign visitor. They weren't paying for tea or music. They were paying for the dream that someone could exist without flaws. The mask sold that dream, at the cost of the person beneath it. Some records even suggest that women would sleep in half makeup to save time. Imagine waking up with one cheek plastered white and the other bare. That's not a glamorous morning routine. That's a horror movie poster. The pillow? Permanently stained, like chalk outlines of your face, repeating night after night. If ghosts were real, they'd look at that pillow and go, "Too much work." Occasionally, the makeup went wrong. A patch peeled, a crack widened. Someone sneezed mid-conversation. Guests were too polite to laugh out loud, but you knew they noticed. Social death didn't need words. Just one raised eyebrow, one whisper at the back of the room. And suddenly you were the girl who flaked. Not in the fun way. It wasn't just the health effects that haunted you. It was the knowledge that your entire worth was wrapped up in not breaking the mask. Every move, every sip of tea, every glance at a guest had to be filtered through layers of toxic powder. The person beneath it shrank smaller every night. And yet, for some, the mask worked too well. It wasn't just a role, it became the face people remembered. Without makeup, apprentices walked through the streets unnoticed. Guests didn't recognize them. Neighbors didn't look twice. The mask wasn't just heavy on your skin, it erased your identity. Without it, you vanished. Now picture this. The evening ends, the lanterns dim, and you're back in the okiya. The mask comes off slowly, painfully. The paste clings, the oils sting, the cloths scrape. Underneath, your skin feels raw, like it resents you. You catch your reflection in a bronze mirror. It's not porcelain anymore. It's just a teenager's face, blotchy, tired, already planning tomorrow's mask. That's the cruel genius of the system. The mask promised beauty, status, admiration, but only if you kept wearing it. It punished you for taking it off, punished you for breathing through it, punished you for being human underneath. Could you survive it? Could you endure night after night of stiff paint, blackened teeth, itchy wigs, heavy collars, and act like it was effortless? Or would you give up halfway through, muttering something about farm life and storming out barefoot? Because remember, this was just the opening act. Makeup was step one. After the mask was built, you still had to play the part. Pour tea, play shamisen, flirt politely without crossing lines, entertain men who didn't know your head was throbbing like a temple bell. So before you pat yourself on the back for surviving this far, take a breath. The white mask didn't end the night. It only unlocked the door to everything else. If you thought the white makeup was rough, congratulations. You've just unlocked the tutorial level. Because before you could even dream of entertaining guests as a geisha, you had to survive years as a maiko. Basically, a teenager whose entire job was to train, smile, and not embarrass the okiya. Which sounds simple, until you realise it's like enrolling in the hardest boarding school in the world. Only with more hairpins and fewer bathroom breaks. You didn't arrive there by accident. Most girls were sent young, 12, 13, maybe 14, old enough to sweep floors, too young to argue. Imagine being told at that age, "Oh, by the way, you're going to live in a dorm with strangers, wear 6 layers of fabric every day, and learn how to pour tea so gracefully it makes men cry." Suddenly, middle school problems feel merciful. The day you entered, you weren't a star, you were the bottom, the lowest rank in the house, which meant chores, endless chores, polishing teacups until you could see your soul in them, cleaning tatami mats that shed like they had allergies, running errands through muddy streets, in shoes clearly designed by someone who hated feet. Every drop of effort was called discipline. You called it "please let me nap." The hierarchy inside an okiya made military barracks look casual. Senior geisha? Gods. Maiko, who'd been there a year? Royalty? You? The unpaid intern, who got yelled at for breathing too loud. And you couldn't complain, because silence was rule number 1. A good maiko was supposed to listen, not talk. Your thoughts? Irrelevant. Your voice? Temporary. One wrong word, and a senior would glare at you like you'd just confessed to burning down Kyoto. Meals? Short, plain, quiet, rice, miso soup, maybe pickled radish. Chew too loud? Someone clears their throat. Eat too slow? Someone sighs. Eating became less nourishment and more oral exam. And no seconds. unless the senior said so. Imagine puberty, while rationed to 2 radishes and half a rice ball. The silence stretched everywhere. Walking down the hall, silent. Folding kimono, silent. Even laughter was regulated. You had to smile. Just enough, not too wide, not too small, never teeth, like some hungry raccoon. They wanted serene elegance, but you were 14. You'd seen a bug fall into the soup. You wanted to laugh until your ribs hurt. Instead, you pressed your lips shut so hard, your jaw clicked like a puppet. Training filled the rest of the day, shamisen until your fingers blistered. Dance routines until your knees wobbled. Calligraphy drills where 1 ink blot meant start over. The teachers weren't cruel, they just believed mistakes built character. Your character now had a stress fracture. Walking was its own nightmare. No strolling like normal people. You had to glide, slow, small steps, posture straight, like an elegant human Roomba. And you did it in Okobo sandals, wooden bricks tied to your feet. Fall once, and the laughter of seniors haunted you forever. Then came bowing. Oh, bowing had levels. Too shallow, disrespectful, too deep, desperate. The right angle was drilled into you daily. Some seniors carried rulers to measure it. Imagine being scolded because your bow was 32 degrees instead of 30. Somewhere, a maiko cried into her futon over a math problem disguised as etiquette. Discipline wasn't abstract, it was physical. Doze off during a lesson, fan tap to the head, mess up a tea pour, cold water down the sleeve. Not punishments, they said. Reminders. You carried reminders like bruises shaped as calligraphy strokes. And always, the hair. No wigs for beginners. Your own hair was styled into shapes that defied gravity and common sense. Sleeping? Impossible. You had a wooden pillow, a block to keep your head stable. If the bun collapsed, the stylist lectured for hours while pulling strands like they owed rent. So you learned to sleep like a corpse. Still, rigid, praying you didn't sneeze. But maybe the hardest part wasn't the silence, or the training, or even the food. It was the waiting, years of it. Every night you watched the seniors leave, painted, glowing, lanterns lighting the street. And you stayed behind, folding fabric, humming shamisen under your breath, wondering if you'd ever be good enough, or if you'd even recognize yourself after so many years of discipline. The absurdity never left though. Girls your age elsewhere, sneaking out to meet friends, trying new hairstyles, writing terrible poetry. You, practicing how to kneel without your toes going numb. They had crushes, you had posture corrections, they worried about acne. You worried if your smile looked like gentle serenity or nervous hostage. And yet, in all that absurdity, there was pride. When you nailed the shamisen piece, when your bow earned a nod instead of a scold, when your kimono folded without a wrinkle, it felt like victory. Tiny, exhausting, but still, victory. Could you survive it? Could you enter an okiya at 13? Surrender your voice and build yourself from scratch? Would you glide, bow and smile through the exhaustion? Or trip in your sandals, break the silence with a laugh, and be remembered forever as that one noisy maiko? Either way, the night was only beginning. By the time you settled into the routine, the training had only gotten stranger. The okiya wasn't just a home, it was a pressure cooker disguised as a dormitory. And you weren't just a teenager. You were a teenager whose every movement was graded like a pop quiz you never studied for. Take mornings, for example. You didn't wake up to birdsong. You woke up to the rustle of senior footsteps and the faint dread of, did I flatten my hair in my sleep? The pillow block was supposed to keep everything intact, but pillows don't care about discipline. Sometimes you woke up with a lopsided bun, half collapsed, looking like a sad rice ball. And the hairdresser didn't laugh. She sighed, loudly, like your entire existence had inconvenienced the cosmos. Breakfast wasn't relief. It was another stage. You were expected to hold chopsticks at the perfect angle, lift bowls gracefully, and chew like a polite ghost. Someone once told you, a true lady eats silently, which was easy advice if you weren't halfway through a dried radish that crunched louder than a temple drum. You learned fast, swallow quick, or risk the withering stare of a senior whose ears apparently worked like bat sonar. Then came the drills, hours of bowing, standing, walking, bowing again, a full-body choreography of humility. One teacher would shout, "Again," every time your angle was off, like bowing was a contact sport. By the end, your thighs burned, your ankles wobbled, and your head felt permanently hinged forward. Congratulations, you'd become furniture. And there were rules about hands. Your hands were never supposed to hang limp. They had to move gracefully, almost like punctuation marks for your body. When serving tea, the wrist turned just so, like a slow exclamation mark. When walking, fingers curled slightly inward, never dangling like dead fish. Forget once and a senior would grab your hand mid-gesture, reposition it like you were an action figure, and then tell you to do it all over again. By the end, you weren't sure if you were a person or a marionette with very fussy puppeteers. Etiquette extended to sound. You practiced greetings until your voice cracked. Each good evening had to sound polite but not desperate, melodic but not fake. Too cheerful, and you sounded childish. Too flat, and you sounded sick. The sweet spot was graceful indifference, which basically meant channeling the energy of a cat who let strangers pet it, but only for 30 seconds. And silence training was its own ordeal. You weren't just learning to be quiet, you were learning to perform quietness. That meant nodding at the right moments, folding your hands calmly, tilting your head slightly when someone else spoke. Inside, you might have been screaming because your knees hurt or you were dying of boredom. But outside, you looked like serenity carved into human form. One girl once sneezed during silence drills. The senior paused, glared, and then declared, "Start over." You spent the next hour not breathing too loud. Discipline also came wrapped in absurd rituals. One classic, carrying trays of teacups across the room without spilling a drop. Easy, right? Except the trays were slippery lacquer, the floor creaked, and your kimono sleeves acted like parachutes catching every draft. Drop a single cup, and it was cleaning duty for days. Rumour said one apprentice tripped, crashed into a wall, and left a tea stain shaped like Buddha's shadow. No one sat in that corner again. Then there was dance training. Oh, the dance training. You weren't learning to dance like a child at a wedding. You were learning to embody poetry, to move as if each step recited a verse. Every flick of the fan, every tilt of the wrist was loaded with meaning. The fan could mean wind, waves, longing, or please don't fall asleep during this performance. Hours of slow, deliberate movements, repeated until your muscles remembered them better than your brain. And if your face twitched the wrong way, you were reminded that serenity didn't include scratching an itch mid-verse. And of course the shamisen, strings that sliced into your fingers until they calloused. Tunes that sounded deceptively simple, repeated endlessly until your head buzzed. A single mistake, and the teacher would stop. Tap the neck of the shamisen with a long stick and say, "Again." The instrument wasn't just wooden strings, it was your eternal nemesis. And still, you smiled. Because even when your fingers screamed, the rule was, always smile. If the training felt overwhelming, that was the point. The system was designed to strip away everything awkward and replace it with control. But the irony was impossible to ignore. You were a teenager, trying to suppress every instinct, laughing too loud, stomping too hard, slouching too much. Somewhere in the world, other kids were running barefoot in fields. You were trying not to sweat through silk sleeves. Evenings weren't restful either. After chores, after drills, after practice, you sat with seniors observing how they applied makeup or adjusted their kimonos. You weren't allowed to ask questions. You just had to memorize everything with your eyes. Occasionally, a senior would quiz you, "How many folds in this sash?" If you answered wrong, the sash came undone, and you had to retie it until midnight. Fabric was both your wardrobe and your punishment. And then came the errands, fetching small items, running messages, delivering notes. The streets at night were filled with lantern glow and the smell of grilled food. You carried letters while your stomach growled, knowing dinner had ended hours ago. If you were lucky, an old shopkeeper would slip you a rice ball. If unlucky, you'd trip in your platform shoes and deliver a note with mud stains. Both happened often enough to feel inevitable. Every night ended the same way: exhaustion. You lay on your futon, hair propped on the block pillow, body sore, stomach half full, mind buzzing with rules. Smile more, speak less, bow deeper, walk slower over and over, until even your dreams were silent, polite, and gracefully timed. So, could you survive it? Could you spend your teenage years bowing, walking, and smiling under constant scrutiny? Would you make it through the absurd drills and endless corrections? Or would you crack halfway, laugh out loud during silence practice, and become the cautionary tale whispered about by every senior? Ah, yes. The girl who couldn't stop giggling at a teacup life in the Okia wasn't just training. It was also about surviving the social jungle of other apprentices. Imagine a house full of teenagers, all competing to be the most elegant, but still teenagers. You had whispered rivalries over hairpins, quiet competitions over who balanced trays best, and the occasional Cold War fought entirely through passive-aggressive bowing. The hierarchy was strict. Seniors sat in the best spots at dinner, got the freshest food, and handed down instructions like tiny emperors. Juniors fetched water, swept floors, and pretended not to notice when seniors, accidentally, hogged the only comfortable cushion. The first lesson of Okia politics. Comfort trickled down slower than miso soup. Still, bonds formed. Late at night, when the lanterns dimmed and the teachers slept, whispers carried across the futons. One girl might complain about her aching feet, another about the smell of her wig oil, another about forgetting a bowing angle, and being corrected so many times her thighs gave out. You laughed quietly, biting sleeves to muffle the sound, because if a senior caught you giggling past curfew, the punishment was usually cleaning teacups until dawn. And nothing is less funny than scrubbing porcelain at sunrise. There were punishments, though, that almost felt designed to be comedy routines. One involved balancing a book on your head for hours. If it slipped, you had to start over. The absurd part? Sometimes teachers stacked more than one. Somewhere in Kyoto, there was a girl standing perfectly still, with 3 books teetering like a miniature library, while others shuffled past with trays of tea. If that doesn't sound like a scene out of slapstick theatre, I don't know what does. And the clothes themselves were their own form of discipline. You didn't just wear a kimono, you lived inside a kimono. Layers of fabric, tied with a sash that felt like a polite boa constrictor. Walking became a side mission in balance. Stairs? A survival sport. If you tripped, you didn't just fall, you toppled like a tightly wrapped futon roll. The older girls swore that grace would come with practice, but the bruises on your shins said otherwise. Meals were another arena for hidden lessons. You were supposed to eat small portions daintily, never showing hunger, except you were hungry, because half your calories went into bowing drills and shamisen practice. One apprentice became famous for sneaking bites when no one looked, chewing with the speed of a thief. The rumour was she once downed half a sweet bun in 3 seconds flat. The teacher caught her mid-chew, but instead of yelling, she just said, "At least she's efficient." That became her unofficial nickname, Efficient Girl. Of course, efficiency didn't save you from voice training. You had to sing, project, and recite lines until your throat felt like parchment. One exercise required reading poetry while holding a mouthful of water, so you learned breath control. Spit too much, and you'd soak your kimono. Hold it too long, and you choked halfway through. Either way, elegance didn't survive. Somewhere in the archives of history are countless kimono stains that were less refined artistry and more oops vocal lesson. And then there was smiling. The endless smiling. You weren't supposed to grin too wide. That was childish. You weren't supposed to keep it flat. That was cold. The ideal smile was somewhere between welcoming and mysterious. Teachers called it the smile that doesn't reveal. To you, it felt more like the smile that cramps the jaw. Try holding one expression for hours while pouring tea, walking, and pretending not to notice your nose itching. At some point, your face just locked into place like wet plaster. Guests probably thought you were serene. In reality, you were praying your muscles wouldn't spasm mid-dance. If this all sounds exhausting, remember, you were still just a teenager. While your peers in the outside world might be fumbling with first crushes or doodling in school notebooks, you were mastering the art of saying, welcome, 300 different ways. Some nights you probably wondered if you'd chosen the harder path, but then, when you caught your reflection, kimono shimmering, posture perfect, hair gleaming under candlelight, you understood why people chased this dream. You looked untouchable, like the kind of elegance even clumsy bruises couldn't erase. Still, would you survive that stage? Could you spend your adolescence learning to smile without laughing, eat without crunching, and walk without tripping on fabric? Or would you be remembered in whispers as the one who ruined silence drills with hiccups? Debut night was the grand test. After years of drills, bows, and tea rehearsals, you finally stepped out in front of paying guests. The lights were low, the room smelled of lacquer and incense, and suddenly every lesson echoed inside your head at once. Walk slowly, tilt the fan, bow without wobbling, don't spill the tea, don't sneeze, definitely don't sneeze. The makeup was flawless, the kimono heavier than any backpack you ever wore, and the wig tight enough to make you forget your own thoughts. But the moment you slid open the door, the chatter dimmed. For one brief second, people actually believed you were composed. The truth was, your socks were damp with sweat. Conversations with guests were an entire discipline. You couldn't just answer questions, you had to dance around them, offer polite laughter, and make the dullest merchant feel like a poet. One man might talk for 20 minutes about rice prices. Your job was to nod with perfect attention, as though grain storage truly was the beating heart of romance. Another might test you with riddles or worse jokes. Laugh too soon, and you spoiled the rhythm. Laugh too late, and you looked lost, the sweet spot. Somewhere between polite chuckle and gentle cough. Entertainment had to look effortless, even though nothing about it was. Playing shamisen with stiff fingers, singing with a dry throat, remembering choreography on tatami mats that were just slippery enough to betray you. Every move was monitored. There was a reason veterans looked serene. Years of panic had been polished into calm. For you, the panic was still very much alive. Sometimes small disasters broke the illusion. A fan slipped, a note wavered, a candle flickered out at the wrong moment. Guests pretended not to notice, because part of the performance was politeness itself. But apprentices knew. Behind the folding screens, there was always a senior shaking her head in slow motion, promising a lecture later that would sting more than any mistake. Food service brought its own landmines. Imagine balancing trays of sake while navigating a maze of elbows and conversations. One wrong tilt, and you baptized a nobleman's sleeve in rice wine. Historical records never wrote about those stains, but they existed, quietly hidden in laundry piles across Kyoto. And each splash probably had its own story. A nervous apprentice, a wobbling hand, a sleeve that just wouldn't stop being in the way. The audience judged more than skill, they judged poise. A trembling hand could undo hours of training. So you learned tricks, slow breathing, steady steps, pressing your tongue lightly against your teeth to stop it from chattering. These weren't ancient rituals, they were survival hacks passed down like secret recipes. Somewhere, someone whispered, "If your legs shake, bend slightly, and pretend it's choreography. By the end of the evening, exhaustion hit like a quiet avalanche. The smile muscles trembled, the fabric cut into your ribs, and the pins in your hair felt like tiny anchors. Yet when the guests bowed farewell and lanterns flickered low, there was a strange satisfaction. You had survived a debut, not gracefully maybe, but enough to count. Walking back to the Okiya in the night air, the city felt different. Streets were quiet, shutters drawn, and your reflection caught in a dark window didn't look like a teenager anymore. You carried the same wig, the same kimono, the same stiff smile, but there was weight in your steps now. The kind that only comes from pulling off something nearly impossible. Somewhere inside, you realised this wasn't just performance, it was transformation. You weren't simply learning to smile, you were learning to hold yourself together while everything underneath wanted to collapse, and somehow that became its own kind of art. So here's the awkward chapter of the night, the one everyone tiptoes around. You can pour tea, you can dance, you can laugh at a patron's bad joke, but then comes the moment where people whisper the word mizuage, and suddenly the room gets quiet, like someone just dropped the word taxes at a dinner party. On the surface, it sounded ceremonial. A maiko, after years of training, finally crosses into full geisha status. There's a banquet, maybe a new hairstyle, gifts, poetry scribbled by men who had too much sake. Guests clapped, elders nodded, the girl bowed. If you squint, it looks like graduation day, except instead of a diploma, the reward was, well, it depended who you asked. That's the problem. No one agreed on what miswaj really was. Some households said it was purely symbolic, ritual, refinement, no scandal. Others treated it more like an auction, with numbers whispered in back rooms and sponsors elbowing for the privilege. Imagine a cultural event that was half debutante ball, half silent eBay listing. For the apprentice, this was both terrifying and surreal. You'd spent years bowing until your spine felt like origami, memorizing jokes that weren't funny, and practicing shamisen until your fingers grew little callus helmets. Then suddenly, the entire neighborhood was talking about your debut, like you were a limited edition trading card. You didn't even need to say anything, just exist in your layers of silk, while adults made financial decisions with your name attached. The banquet itself could be dazzling. Lanterns glowing, trays of food stacked high, incense smoke mixing with the sweet smell of plum wine. Somewhere in the corner, a poet scribbled verses about blossoms and first dawns, which sounded romantic until you realised he was writing about your contract, not the weather. Guests laughed, sponsors bragged, and you sat still, smiling through the dizziness of too tight hairpins. But if you peek behind the curtain, it was math, pure survival math. An Okiya invested heavily in every girl. Tuition for lessons, expensive kimono rentals, endless makeup trays. None of that came cheap. By the time you reached debut, your tab was high enough to pay for a small bridge. Miswaj payments covered the bill. Without it, the house would collapse under silk debt. Of course, the sponsors weren't just paying out of kindness. Attaching your name to a debut meant prestige. You got bragging rights in tea houses, a reputation boost in merchant circles, and the smug satisfaction of pointing to a rising geisha and saying, "Yes, I helped launch her career." Never mind that you couldn't even tune a shamisen yourself, you still got the credit. And then there's the gossip. Always gossip. Some stories claim the sponsor's privilege included a first night. Others insist it was only ritual. Nothing physical, just a haircut and a toast. The evidence is messy. Ledgers, diary scraps, ukiyo-e prints that look suspiciously like visual innuendo. Historians still argue. Meanwhile, the girls themselves were expected to smile politely, while strangers debated what may or may not have happened in their bedrooms. Think about being 16, hair lacquered into a tower, your head heavy enough to tilt a scale, and realising people were bidding on your symbolic first. You're still figuring out how to walk in wooden sandals without tripping. And meanwhile, the town newsletter is practically live tweeting your future. Different cities handled it differently. Kyoto leaned one way, Edo another. Some households kept it quiet, a family-style ritual with tea, hair and blessings. Others treated it like public theatre, with crowds craning to see which merchant had the fattest wallet. By sunrise, your name was already stamped into rumour cycles faster than you could remove your makeup. And yet for many apprentices, there was pride in it too, a sense of arrival. You'd survived years of training, humiliation, endless corrections from senior geisha who could spot a crooked bow from 50 paces. Finally, you were recognised as more than a trainee. The cost ignored. The whispers pretended away. Sometimes the easiest way to survive was to laugh at the absurdity. Because nothing says adulthood like strangers arguing whether your milestone was a ritual haircut or a financial transaction disguised as poetry. Either way, the girl in the middle had no choice but to bow, smile, and keep her voice steady, while the world decided what her night meant. Let's stay with that banquet hall a bit longer. The air was thick, not just with incense, but with talk. Men leaned in, whispering numbers into each other's sleeves. Apprentices sat rigid, pretending not to hear, while food went cold on the trays. If you ever wondered how economics looked in silk, this was it. Negotiations disguised as polite conversation. Sometimes the debates got strange. Was mizwaj a sacred step? A flower opening ceremony, all about symbolism? Or was it, bluntly, a business deal? The answer depended on who you asked. Elders insisted it was ancient tradition. Patrons bragged, like they'd won an auction. Apprentices, if they were honest, just wanted the banquet to end, so they could take off the £3 wig. Records don't agree either. Some ledgers list mizwaj fees in neat columns, right next to expenses for charcoal and rice, as if a girl's coming of age sat on the same line item as firewood. Other sources describe poetry readings, haircuts, toasts with sake, no money mentioned at all. Historians argue, and in the middle of it, the geisha themselves rarely got a say. Then there are the prints. Ukiyo-e artists loved this topic. They painted scenes with fans hiding smiles, shadows stretching long, gestures that could be read two ways. Was that a celebration or a contract signing? Hard to tell. One woodblock shows a banquet with trays piled high, a girl bowing, men drinking. The caption praises her blooming. No footnotes, of course. You're left staring, wondering how much was ritual and how much was rumour. And rumours, those never stopped. One diary notes a sponsor claiming rights to a first night, though it's written in code, like someone trying to gossip while pretending they weren't gossiping. Another says it was only symbolic, sealed with a hairstyle change. The truth was slippery. Maybe both versions existed, side by side, depending on the house, the city, or the wallet involved. For the maiko, the gossip was worse than the event. You could train for years and still end up defined by a single night you didn't even control. Girls whispered to each other in dormitories, trying to decode what actually happened in other houses. Seniors gave vague advice. Some said smile and bow. Others said smile wider. Helpful, right? It wasn't just men watching either. Rival houses tracked each other's mizwaj like sports scores. Who got the highest bid? Whose apprentice looked the most composed? Who fainted halfway through? That last one did happen. Taitobi, too much sake, not enough food. Collapsing in front of patrons didn't cancel the debt. It just gave everyone something new to whisper about. And there was money. Always money. Payments could clear debts, or in some cases sink a girl deeper into them. Patrons promised more than they delivered. Okiya owners exaggerated numbers to save face. By the time it all filtered through rumour mills, a modest ceremony could sound like the sale of a small kingdom. Strangely, despite all the whispering, mizwaj was still framed as honourable. A turning point. Something every apprentice expected, even dreaded, but also needed to pass. Refusing wasn't an option. unless you enjoyed being called lazy, ungrateful, or worse, unfinished. What stands out is how public it all was. Modern milestones, graduations, birthdays, maybe a driver's license, are celebrated with friends and family. This one unfolded in front of sponsors, rivals, and half the neighbourhood. You couldn't blink without someone analysing it. Even your smile angle became material for gossip. Too wide, try hard, too small, ungrateful, perfect. No one remembered, because the scandal always got more attention. And after all that noise, the night ended like any other. Lanterns dimmed, trays stacked, apprentices shuffled back to cramped sleeping quarters. You carried the same debts, the same lessons, the same schedule for tomorrow. Only now, you were labelled grown. Whether you felt grown or not wasn't part of the calculation. So the debate lingers. Was Mizwaj a ritual? A market transaction? Both? The records contradict each other. The art teases without clarifying. The rumours keep the whole thing foggy. But one truth is clear. The apprentice rarely controlled the story. Everyone else did. And that might be the strangest part of all. Once the ceremony started, there was no graceful escape. Guests settled in, trays of food appeared, and the air thickened with incense and nervous sweat. The apprentices sat perfectly upright, trained smiles in place, trying not to look terrified. On paper, it was a dignified ritual. In practice, it was part business deal, part awkward family dinner. The most bizarre part is how the same night could be remembered two completely different ways. For one audience, it was solemn, noble, and poetic. For another, it was just a party where too many people got tipsy, while money quietly changed hands. And the apprentices? They didn't get to pick which version followed their name. Once the whispers started, the label stuck. Some patrons inflated their role on purpose. A man might pay a modest fee, but brag the next week that he had spent a fortune. Nobody checked receipts. Prestige worked on volume. The louder you bragged, the more people believed you. It's basically the Edo-era version of posting vacation photos with heavy filters. Imagine being the teenager at the centre of this. Everyone debating your worth, while you pretend you can't hear a word. You keep your eyes down, hands folded, waiting for the right cue to bow. Inside your head, you're screaming, "Can we skip to dessert, please?" Of course, mistakes happened. One diary mentions a patron who fell asleep before the main toast, snoring loudly while the musicians played on. Another tells of a wig catching on fire from a lantern. Nobody recorded what happened after the flames. Probably chaos, shouting, maybe someone panicking with a teapot of hot water. A night meant to define a career could just as easily be remembered as the one with the burnt wig. The haircut ritual wasn't immune to disaster either. It was meant to be symbolic, a visible sign of maturity, but scissors slip. One wrong angle, and you're stuck with uneven bangs for months. And rivals didn't let you forget it. Patrons chuckled, seniors smirked, even apprentices muttered nicknames. Imagine being introduced with dignity while everyone's thinking, "Oh, the lopsided one." What's striking is how normalised it all was. No one thought twice about parading teenagers through this process. It was simply how things are. The apprentices coached each other like athletes before a match. Keep your back straight. Don't cough during the chant. Try to look flattered. You weren't just performing for patrons, you were performing the idea of tradition itself. Records show the financial side could get absurd. Some Okia padded the numbers, charging patrons inflated prices, then writing down an even bigger number for posterity. So a ceremony might actually cost the price of a cow, but be remembered as if it cost a palace. This wasn't fraud, it was branding. And branding in this world mattered more than truth. Let's pause. Think about the actual girl behind the ritual. She probably woke up the next morning with sore shoulders, powdered makeup still clinging to her pillow, and a headache from incense. Did she feel transformed? Some journals say no. One wrote bluntly, "I was tired." The next day I practiced shamisen. No mystical rebirth, just chores. Yet ukiyo-e prints celebrated these events as moments of elegance, like something eternal. Artists painted the smiles, the poised gestures, the flickering lamps. Nobody painted the girl shifting uncomfortably in her seat, or the rice ball that fell on the floor, or the cough she tried to hide during the speech. That gap, the image versus the reality, explains why debate lingers. Historians argue, was it a rite of passage or just a market transaction? The truth is that it was both, and neither. It was a performance everyone agreed to treat as sacred, even while knowing half of it was improvised. And rumours added spice. Some whispered that certain patrons competed secretly, bidding in shadows like gamblers. Others said herbal mixtures were given to apprentices beforehand, to calm their nerves or to make them seem more glowing. No one confirmed it, but the stories linger. Because in a system this strange, every rumour feels possible. One curious anecdote. A ceremony that ended early because the host's dog escaped into the room, leaping onto trays and stealing food. Guests laughed, apprentices froze. The ritual stopped until the dog was caught. Somewhere in official records that night was written as a dignified passage. Somewhere in reality, everyone still smelled like dog breath. That's the contradiction. A ritual dressed in seriousness, weighed down with symbolism, but fragile enough to be derailed by spilled soup or runaway pets. For outsiders, it looked majestic. For insiders, it was just one more test of endurance. And maybe that's why the legacy is so split. The patrons remembered grandeur, the apprentices remembered indigestion. Both were true. Both survive in whispers, prints and ledgers. The rest is argument. What makes the Mizwaj so sticky in historical debates is that almost no one agrees on what it meant. To some, it was clearly a business, numbers, patrons, profits. To others, it was framed as a sacred threshold, the step between childhood and artistry. The split isn't just academic, it shaped how geisha were remembered in their own lifetimes. If you read travel diaries from the Edo period, the descriptions vary wildly. One traveller might rave about the grace of a blossoming flower, while another mutters about a crowded room where everyone argued about the bill. Same ritual, two totally different Yelp reviews. And just like Yelp, the loudest voices often drowned out the quiet truths. Archaeologists find traces in the form of ledgers, hair ornaments, prints. Ledgers show the numbers, painfully detailed. Ornaments mark the occasion, sometimes gifted and kept for years. Prints, they turn the whole thing into an aesthetic tableau, erasing the awkward realities. It's like framing your graduation photo without showing the part where your hat fell off your head. One ukiyo-e print in particular shows a maiko stepping forward, surrounded by lantern light. Everyone looks serene, orderly, elegant. Yet somewhere just outside the frame, an apprentice was rushing to refill cups. A guest was coughing. Someone tripped over their sandals. The image sells a dream that daily life could never quite match. The irony is, those dreams travelled farther than the people themselves. Collectors in Europe and America swooned over these prints centuries later, romanticising rituals they never experienced. Meanwhile, the actual girls had long since grown old, debts unpaid, memories fading. History kept the image. Reality slipped quietly out the back door. There's also the cultural split. Not all geisha went through Mizwaj. Not all communities followed the same pattern. Some houses dropped the practice earlier, others doubled down. The rules weren't fixed, they were more like guidelines, and guidelines, as we know, are often bent when money enters the room. Historians today argue fiercely about definitions. Some insist the ceremony was symbolic only, a kind of staged adulthood. Others argue that it was very much transactional. Both camps produce examples. Both accuse the other of ignoring context. The truth is messier, sometimes symbolic, sometimes transactional, often both in the same evening. Think about that. One girl could experience the ritual as a ceremonial milestone, another as a sale, another as a farce derailed by a drunk patron. None of them wrong, all of them true. It depended on the night, the people, the house, which makes writing history about it feel like trying to describe soup using only receipts. One overlooks detail, the sheer pressure on apprentices. They didn't get to choose what story survived. If their ceremony was remembered in poetry, they became a symbol of grace. If it was remembered in gossip, they became a cautionary tale. That's not heritage, it's a lottery with bad odds. And yet, in the middle of all this, daily routines continued. Shamisen lessons the next morning. Cleaning duties, debt tallies. Nobody said, "Take a week off, you've crossed a threshold." The ceremony may have been called a transformation, but transformation didn't exempt you from scrubbing teacups. Rumours followed these girls for years. Some patrons claimed lifelong connection to the one they sponsored, even if they only met once. Others bragged loudly, but vanished the next day, leaving only unpaid promises. The apprentices had to navigate it all, while still learning songs and dances. It's hard not to notice how much theatre was built into the process. Everyone knew parts were exaggerated, but everyone played along. Patrons pretended generosity was endless. Okiya pretended debts weren't crushing. Apprentices pretended nerves didn't exist. Together, they held up the illusion, because breaking it would ruin the game. And maybe that's the real lesson of Mizwaj. Not whether it was sacred or sordid, but how a society can build an entire structure out of mutual pretending. Each person holding the mask in place, even while sweating underneath. Was it a rite of passage? Yes. Was it a market exchange? Also, yes. Was it something else entirely? An improvised drama nobody dared interrupt? Probably. Like so many traditions, it was exactly what people said it was, until someone whispered otherwise, and the whispers never stopped. Here's the part nobody likes to talk about, the bill. Behind every shimmering kimono, every dazzling performance, there was an account book quietly fattening itself in the background. The Okiya wasn't just a household, it was a business, and businesses kept score in ink. Every lesson, on your tab. Every costume, on your tab. Even the hair oil, tab. By the time a girl stepped into her role as a full geisha, she had accumulated a ledger that looked less like coming-of-age expenses and more like national debt simulation. Kimonos especially were heavy hitters. Not just literally heavy, though wearing 3 layers in summer made you feel like a decorative oven, but financially crushing. A high-quality kimono could cost the equivalent of months of wages for an ordinary family. And you didn't just need one. You needed several, rotated with the seasons, styled with the right obi, matched with the right accessories. Think less wardrobe and more subscription service where you never stopped paying. The absurdity? You didn't own them. Most were property of the Okiya. The moment you thought, at least this beautiful silk is mine, someone reminded you that technically you were renting elegance. Each swish of fabric was another line on the balance sheet. Sometimes a patron stepped in, covering debts, gifting kimonos, paying for training. It sounds generous, but generosity always had strings attached. A patron didn't clear your debt. He transferred it into his own account. And now you owed him instead of the Okiya. Chains changed hands, but chains remained. Picture this. A wealthy merchant beams as he presents you with a new kimono, radiant in colours reserved for the season. He gets praised as magnanimous. You get a garment so expensive you're scared to sneeze while wearing it. Meanwhile, the real winner is the Okiya ledger, which just logged another boost in reputation without losing a coin. Small detail, kimonos required constant upkeep. Silk doesn't forgive spilled tea, incense smoke, or accidental trips in wooden sandals. So apprentices learned to sit, stand and move in ways that protected the garment first, body second. If your ankle twisted, the rule was simple. Save the fabric. Nobody paid to see you limp, but they would notice if the embroidery snagged. The economics extended to every corner of the night. Pouring tea wasn't just pouring tea, it was demonstrating that the patron's money was well spent. Playing shamisen wasn't just art, it was proof of the hours of lessons somebody financed. Even conversation was a kind of accounting. Smooth words validated debts already incurred. And yet, for all the talk of glamour, the financial pressure was relentless. Some girls worked for years without ever seeing a zero balance. Retirement often arrived before solvency. A lifetime in performance, and the final act was realizing the okiya still technically owned your best kimono. The cruel trick was how normalized it all became. Everyone knew the system. Everyone shrugged and said, "That's just how it works." Like paying airport fees on a flight you already bought, except stretched over an entire adulthood. What did this do to relationships? It blurred them. Patrons who covered debts weren't just admirers. They became entangled in a woman's career, her choices, even her freedom to leave. Some called it support, others called it possession. Either way, the effect was the same. Your debts decided who you spent your nights with. And don't think apprentices didn't notice. Teenagers may not have had a choice, but they could see the strings. They whispered about patrons like characters in a play. Hero, villain, comic relief. Except unlike plays, this one never had a final curtain. The balance of power rested less on affection, and more on who could settle which line in the ledger. Love might have bloomed here and there, but mostly it was an economy dressed in poetry. People toasted to art, beauty, refinement. The books toasted to compound interest. Some apprentices dreamed of patrons who would set them free. Some got lucky, some didn't. For every fairy tale story of a girl whose debt vanished with one generous hand, there were dozens whose debt only multiplied. When patrons changed, when kimonos wore out, when illness delayed their work. The kimono, in this sense, was both symbol and trap. Worn proudly in public, admired endlessly. Yet at night, it whispered numbers you couldn't escape. Silk threads bound tighter than iron. And here's the question. When every laugh, every song, every bow carried an invisible price tag, did freedom ever exist at all? Or was it always just rented by the hour? Let's zoom in on a random night. The room glows, with lanterns. You're sitting perfectly upright. Ankles folded, under silk. That costs more than your entire family's house. A patron leans in, complimenting your shamisen skills. You smile, you bow, you thank him. Inside, you're mostly thinking, please don't spill sake on this kimono, or I'll never hear the end of it. Because here's the truth. Every stain was a financial crime. If wine dripped, the fabric went to cleaning. If incense ash burned a hole, repairs piled on the bill. And guess whose account it landed on? Yours, not the guest's. The guest walked away, with a story about the charming geisha who laughed at his jokes. You walked away, with another line in the ledger, silently muttering, "Cool, I just paid rent for your clumsy hands." Sometimes the absurdity popped out in conversation. A girl might joke with her fellow apprentice, "Did you see the merchant last night? The one with the loud laugh?" "Yes." He leaned too far over the brazier, singed half his sleeve. Guess who got charged for the smoke smell? Both girls burst into laughter, not because it was funny, but because crying was too expensive. That was the rhythm of life in the okiya. You worked, you smiled, you bowed, and behind it all, the bills stacked like dominoes. Even hair maintenance had an economic shadow. Those elaborate styles, they weren't quick buns you tied before leaving the house. They required specialists, hairdressers who came with fees, pins, oils, endless adjustments. And again, the cost circled back to you. Imagine being 14, sitting for hours while someone pulled your scalp tight, and all you could think was, another coin, another coin, another coin. But the truly human part, nobody lived in balance sheets alone. Between scoldings and ledgers, There were bursts of friendship. Girls whispered secrets after lessons, shared tiny sweets when no one looked. Sometimes laughed so hard, their white paint cracked. The debt loomed, yes, but so did the sound of muffled giggles. From futons lined side by side, the contrast made everything stranger. By day, you were an adolescent, worried about pimples, sore ankles, or whether your shamisen strings would snap mid-performance. By night, you were a professional hostess, dressed in fabric worth more than your entire neighbourhood. 2 lives, 1 body. Both expensive. Some patrons blurred that line even further. A generous sponsor might pay for your medical care if makeup fumes made you ill, or cover tuition for another round of dance training. That sounds kind. But generosity had an echo. He'd remind you of it later, always casually, always with a smile. Remember, I covered your lesson fees. Surely you'll be free tomorrow night. And just like that, your schedule wasn't yours anymore. The Okia system had a wordless efficiency. No one sat you down with a PowerPoint explaining compound debt. You just lived it. You woke up, you trained, you performed, you bowed. At some point you realised the only free thing in the house was the rice you ate. And even that, technically, came off the house account. Older Geisha sometimes joked about it. I've been paid 3 times in my life, one might whisper. Once when I was born, once when I retired, and once when someone dropped a coin by accident and I picked it up before they noticed. Deadpan delivery. Everyone laughed, because if you didn't laugh, you'd choke. Here's another tiny human moment. You're exhausted, slipping off your heavy sandals after a long evening. You rub your toes, wincing. Next to you, another girl mutters, "My patron gave me new hairpins." Guess what? They're too heavy. My neck hurts. And I still owe him tea service next week. You both groan. Then, you both laugh. Pain and debt. But at least, shared pain and debt. What made it heavier was how invisible it was to outsiders. Guests saw elegance, smooth conversation, dazzling performance. They never saw the girl counting coins in her head while pouring their drink. They never heard the quick mental math. 1 kimono equals 6 months of dances. 1 repair equals 3 weeks of shamisen lessons. The ledger wasn't always written on paper. It was etched into daily choices. Do you eat the sweet dumpling offered by a guest, knowing the sugar might stain your lips and ruin the delicate paint? Do you laugh too loudly, risking a crack in your makeup, which means another costly reapplication? Tiny decisions, all linked to invisible debt. At some point, you stop asking, "When will I be free?" and start asking, "Whose chain is lighter today? The Okiya's or the patron's?" That was survival, not breaking free, but choosing which leash chafed less. And still, within those chains, girls carved out humanity. They teased each other, practiced songs late at night, sometimes even fell asleep mid-conversation, leaning shoulder to shoulder. Silk chains or not, there was always warmth in small rebellions. Laughing too loud, sneaking an extra bite, whispering about the guest who talked too much. It wasn't freedom, but it was life, and for many, that was enough. Enough to get through the next performance, the next kimono fitting, the next bill, waiting in the ledger. Picture the ledger again, lines of debt inked neatly. But what the ledger couldn't capture was the awkward silence when a patron gave you an unexpected gift. Not a coin, not food, sometimes something useless but expensive, like a folding fan painted with a mountain no one recognized. You bowed, thanked him, and later whispered to another girl, "Do you think I can trade Mount Weird for hair oil?" She shook her head. "No one wants mountains. You're stuck." That's how patronage often worked. A man could pour money into your career, buy your kimonos, even pay off part of your debts. And in return, you were expected to be endlessly grateful, endlessly available, endlessly elegant. The cost wasn't written down, but it was there in the way your schedule bent around his whims. Some patrons didn't even bother with subtlety. They'd arrive unannounced, expect tea, music, laughter, all on their terms. You smiled. Because refusing meant gossip. Gossip meant risk. One careless whisper that you were ungrateful. And suddenly your bookings dried up. Sometimes, though, the imbalance tipped into comedy. Imagine a wealthy merchant, too drunk to remember your name, loudly calling you that one with the nice sleeves. You keep playing shamisen, he keeps forgetting. The next day, he sends a silk sash to nice sleeves. And now the nickname sticks. For months, every girl in the house teases you. "Ah, nice sleeves, pour me some tea." You laugh along. Because honestly, better that than crumbly face girl. Behind the laughter, the system kept pulling. An Okia could demand repayment for years. Some women never truly paid off the ledger. Others found a way through a single generous patron who essentially bought them out. But even then, freedom came with strings. You belonged less to the house and more to the man. There were rules about it too. Officially, patrons weren't supposed to control your choices. Unofficially, money always speaks louder. A sponsor could decide which performances you attended, which gifts you wore, even which songs you practiced. You were still smiling, still bowing, but now performing for one person, not the room. Let's pause on something small. Imagine you've just finished a long evening. Your cheeks ache from smiling. Your toes burn. Your shoulders are stiff. You finally collapse onto a futon. Next to you, another girl whispers, "My patron insists I wear the green kimono tomorrow, the one with the crane embroidery." You groan. "Isn't that one impossible to walk in?" she sighs. "Yes." He says it makes me look graceful. It makes me look trapped. Both of you laugh in the dark, muffling it under sleeves, so no one hears. And that's the thing. Bonds formed in the quiet, shared exhaustion, whispered complaints, jokes about guests who snored too loudly. Those moments kept you human, even while the system turned you into a product. Not all patrons were tyrants. Some genuinely cared. They'd send medicine if you were sick, pay for extra lessons, or quietly cover a bill without reminding you. But even the kind ones lived in the same system. Their support always circled back as obligation. You couldn't shake the awareness that one day you'd be expected to repay. The tension showed up in strange places. A girl might receive a lavish kimono, but not enough allowance to afford new sandals. So she glided into the tea house in shimmering silk, while her toes peeked through worn soles. Guests admired the silk. Nobody noticed the blisters. Later, she whispered to her friend, "If I sell the sandals, maybe I can pay for medicine." Her friend replied, "If you sell the kimono, you'll be free." Both knew it was a joke. Neither laughed too hard. Debt, patronage, power. They weren't abstract. They were daily. A coin missing from your pouch meant less rice. A patron's bad mood meant fewer invitations. A gossip rumour meant bills unpaid. But it wasn't only heavy. Sometimes absurdity broke through. One story tells of a patron who insisted his favourite geisha sing only about autumn, no matter the season. Summer heat, spring blossoms, it didn't matter. She had to croon about red leaves falling. She did it, of course, while side-eyeing her friends, who stifled laughter behind their sleeves. The house ledger may not record it, but you know that night became legend. And that's what survival looked like. You weren't just navigating debt, you were navigating egos, preferences, and unspoken rules. You performed not just songs and dances, but also gratitude, an endless choreography where one wrong step meant another tally on the account. The cruel joke, even after years of service, after debts finally balanced, after patrons moved on, many women stayed. Why? Because by then, the Okia wasn't just a chain, it was also home. The futons, the shared laughter, the endless drills, they were chains and comfort, all at once. Maybe that's the paradox. A system that bound you with silk and number, but also gave you identity. chains that looked like beauty, debts that looked like luxury, obligations that looked like art. And you, sitting in the middle, smiling politely, quietly calculating whether tonight's compliments would cost more than they paid. Picture the house again at dawn. The party is over, the lanterns snuffed out, the air thick with smoke that clings to your sleeves. You shuffle back to your room, body sore, ledger still waiting, like an unpaid bill at the end of a long meal. The room isn't glamorous, it's futons, clutter, maybe a forgotten rice ball in the corner, and yet, somehow, this was the beating heart of the whole system. Morning meant chores. You could pour tea for nobles at midnight, but by sunrise you were scrubbing floors or folding futons. The debt didn't care that you were tired. The system didn't pause because your foot blistered. You whispered to the girl next to you, "If I sleep standing up, does that still count as rest?" She mumbled back, half asleep. "Only if you don't fall over." Both of you chuckled, before dragging yourselves through the motions. That balance, performer at night, servant by day, kept the cycle alive. The Okia profited from every role you played. Even your mistakes added value. Break a hairpin? It goes on the ledger. Spill tea? Ledger. Breathe too loudly? Near silk? Ledger. By evening, the running joke among girls was, "Careful, or they'll charge us for blinking." And still, there was pride. No matter how heavy the debts, the moment you stepped into the tea house, you carried yourself like royalty. Patrons saw poise, elegance, skill. They never saw the bruises from clogs that pinched, or the way your stomach growled after skipping breakfast to save rice. That was part of the illusion. Perfection in the front room, chaos in the back. The chains weren't just numbers on a page, they were physical too. A kimono could weigh 20 pounds. Walking in it felt like dragging half a futon with you. Sitting down was an event. Standing back up, an athletic achievement. And yet, guests applauded your grace. One girl once muttered under her breath, "If they think this is graceful, they should try going to the toilet in it." The room nearly collapsed from suppressed laughter. Sometimes power shifted in odd ways. A patron could boast of his influence, but then fall asleep mid-banquet, snoring loudly while you poured tea for his friends. Suddenly the geisha was the one controlling the mood, keeping the room alive while the supposed master drooled into his sleeve. Power was slippery like that. On paper, it belonged to men with coins. In practice, it danced wherever the women directed attention. Still, the Okia always won. Even if you found small freedoms, the house was the spine. The rules were clear. You owed, you paid, you smiled, you performed. And yet women carved out small rebellions, sharing jokes, swapping hair oil, singing songs slightly off-key just to amuse each other when guests weren't listening. Those human scraps made the system survivable. Think about the economics for a moment. A single kimono could equal years of wages for a farmer. A single night's performance could feed a household. But inside the Okia, the numbers twisted. You were both priceless and perpetually broke. It was a strange alchemy, turning silk into chains and chains into art. And then there was the question no one voiced. What happens when you age out? Not every woman could stay luminous forever. Some shifted into teaching, training new apprentices. Others quietly faded, debts partially repaid, stories half told. The house rolled on, lanterns lit for the next performance. The next girl painted white, the next ledger line. A visiting scholar once noted, the true wealth of a geisha house wasn't in coins, but in reputation. A single scandal could undo years of careful illusion. That's why silence was enforced, why complaints stayed whispered under futons, instead of shouted in the streets. You didn't just carry debt, you carried the dignity of the house, whether you wanted to or not. But here's the soft truth. For many women, despite the debt, despite the weight, the Okia was still the only place they felt they belonged. Outside, choices were narrower. Farm labour, factory lines, marriages that didn't promise freedom. Inside, at least, there was music, companionship and the chance, however slim, for admiration. So survival wasn't just about escaping the chains. It was about finding meaning while wearing them. Jokes shared at dawn, compliments whispered in passing. A rare evening when your song landed perfectly, and the room hushed in genuine awe. These weren't ledger entries. These were the parts that made the burden livable. At the end of it all, the paradox stayed. You were bound by silk and debt, but also lifted by the same. The chains glittered, the chains suffocated, and yet, somehow, they made a world where you existed not just as labour, but as presence, as memory, as art. The ledger closed, the lanterns dimmed, the debts never truly disappeared. But the echoes of laughter in the okiya, those lingered, unwritten, unpaid, and untaxed.